How's everybody doing? We are really glad that you're here. Hey, there you are. I didn't see you before. You guys look great. All right. I thought it was just me and the clapping. I didn't know. Anyway, all right. So I don't know if you've ever been to Disney World when on the weekends that they're doing the marathon races. It's such a treat because you easily identify anyone who has run in one of these races because they're all wearing their medals. Because what's the point of running a race if you can't brag about it afterwards? And so the last time I went, it was around the time that they were running the races, like the November race. And I don't know what got into me, but every person, so I'm riding in the monorail, and every person that I would see that was wearing a medal, I felt the need to tell them about the races that I had run. So they were like, they had the medal. I'm like, oh, you ran the race. You ran the marathon yesterday? Oh, that's cool. I ran the Star Wars 10K a couple years ago. No big deal. And they were like, oh, that's nice. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty awesome. Anyway, then I'd see somebody else. I'd tell them the same thing. Like, yeah, I ran the Star Wars 10K. No big deal. And then they'd ask me like, oh, how fast did you run it in? And I'm like, whoa, slow down. Why are you asking me all these personal questions, freak? But I ran, so the first year that they did the Star Wars races, I ran the 5K and then I ran the 10K the next day. And so I ran the 5K with my niece Sarah, my daughter Mia, and my son Xander, and it was tons of fun because you're running through the parks and the kids were young, so it was a lot of fun. The 10K was different because the whole way it started of going was because a few people on the Calvary staff were like, hey, it'd be cool if we ran this race. So I'm like, yeah, that's cool. So we all signed up for it. And then I was, the folks from the Calvary staff that went, they were all kind of grouped together in this corral that was up front. And somehow I got put all the way in the back, that kind of one of the last groupings. And so, which I would have been okay with being in a different group, but they put me with all these mutants. And I'm like, I am so much faster than all these people. At least that's what I thought. I mean, I'm not super fast, but you put me around the elderly or the infirmed, and I am like Usain Bolt. And so anyway, I should not have judged these people is really the point of it. So there was, you're getting ready, and I'm looking around, and I'm like, yeah, I could take all these people. And there was a 90-year-old man. He was wearing a shirt, said he was 90. And who I judged internally. I judged him hard. And I'm like, this guy. Anyway, this guy left me in the dust. Apparently, he is some ancestor of Speedy Gonzalez because this guy was just smoked everybody. There's another guy in the corral who had a literal broken leg. Now, I'm not like, oh, his leg was bothering him. I'm saying this man had a full cast and was running like this. And I'm like, how are you going to do that for 6 miles? But I'm like, I don't care. I'm going to beat you. And which I did. I was close. But I mean, I got him by a good 90 seconds, I beat him. There was the lady that was wearing the weird backpack, which anyway, turned out to be an oxygen tank. It's not a big deal, but she finished like 10 minutes before me. And I complained. And I'm like, that she had, this was an illegal help that she had. If I was getting pumped with oxygen, I probably would have finished way faster too. She should probably be disqualified. And anyway, they told me they were going to throw me out if I didn't stop talking. So I just moved on. Anyway, and then there was the girl who was, now you got to understand, this is a Star Wars race. People are dressed up like Star Wars characters. I wasn't, but other people were. And so this lady was dressed up like a TIE fighter. Like she had created her own TIE fighter costume. If you don't know what a TIE fighter is, that's okay, but it does mean we can't be friends. So I am keeping pace with her most of the race. And then we hit the 6 mile mark and she just explodes with speed. And I'm thinking like, she was holding back? And I'm like, that was all I had in the tank. Anyway, she explodes with speed. And when she does, she drops her phone. So I pick up her phone. And by the way, I don't know who this person is, but I just pick up her phone just to be nice. And so, and I'm thinking, I have to catch up with her because it's 0.2 miles left. I got to catch up with her before she gets to the finish line. Because if she gets to the finish line and then, you get these races like a sea of people afterwards, like I'm never going to be able to give her phone back. So I am running as fast as I can to catch up to her. And I'm not that far behind her, but I am a bit behind. So she stops at the finish line to take a picture of herself at the finish line, and then she realizes she doesn't have her phone. She starts looking around. Well, eventually, now mind you, she had gotten there, I don't know, let's just say 30 seconds, 1 minute before I did. I am going like all 8 cylinders trying to get there. I get to the end, and I am huffing and puffing. I'm like, you dropped your phone. I mean, I sounded like Darth Vader, so at least thematically I was correct. And then she's like, oh, hey, thanks so much. Like, no heavy breathing. Like, she's not, like, this was not a tough thing for her. And so anyway, we get to, there's a picture that they took at the finish line. Let me tell you about this guy right here. This guy is done. He's done. That is the face of a man who says the Star Wars race was really just a whole bunch of running. Because I don't know if you know this, but if you run a Star Wars race, it really has nothing to do with any of the Star Wars characters or movies. It's just running. And then when you get to a mile marker, it's a picture of one of the Star Wars characters, and it's like, mile 2. We got to mile 6, and it was a picture of Jabba the Hutt. And I'm like, how dare you? That dude has never run anywhere ever. And anyway, I was so triggered by that. And so, anyway, we can take that down. And so, but I was complaining, about the race the whole time. And I'm like, if my shorts are loose and my shirt is tight, and that's why. And then I just like, you know what? I discovered this Bible verse that has really helped me and when it comes to running. The wicked flee when no one pursues. So whenever you see, when you're driving to church and you see someone out running, remember this: the wicked run when no one is pursuing them. So whenever I see someone running, I'm like, oh wow, look at you. But you know what the righteous are? Bold as a lion. You ever see a lion? Yeah, you know what they're doing? Sleeping. That's right. You want to be godly? Take a nap. All right? So, anyway. But I'll tell you what's amazing to me, because, once again, I was at almost the back of the line. I got to have this experience that I hadn't before, and that is like what happens at the very end of a race, marathon or whatever. And so there's this golf cart, which I didn't know that this existed. There is a golf cart at the very end of where people are running that just picks people up that don't want to run anymore. So now I can understand. Now, these are things I think about. When you're running, you got like forever. So I'm running, and I'm thinking, because I see the golf cart, and it's like, hey, you in? And I'm like, no, man, maybe a little later. And then I thought, like, is it okay if I get in the cart? Can I get out of the cart? Just maybe drop me off right before the finish. Like, we can't do that. And I'm like, well, then, dude, what good are you? Anyway. So, but what they have is they. It's so good. So, because I can understand with the golf, like if someone twists an ankle or they pull something, totally understand why they would have a golf cart. But there were so many people that they picked up. They're like, hey, yeah, this is not what I thought. I don't want to run anymore. And it's just, well, first of all, I understand it, but I'm like, it's so weird because at the beginning of the race, it's not like that. At the beginning of the race, everybody is gung-ho. We're focused on a singular purpose. We are going to run this race. We're going to do it fast. And then people just start dropping off for all these different reasons. Now, let me tell you how it works. And once again, if we can now switch, let me tell you how it works. God wants to do things in the world. And he wants to empower you with gifts and talents and abilities. He gives you passion that's in your heart. And man, it's so amazing when you have something you're passionate about and it is in alignment with the gifts, talents, and abilities that he's given you. But here's the thing that happens. Even if those things are in alignment, that doesn't mean that everything is going to go perfect. Because we still need wisdom. And even with wisdom, it's not a guarantee that we're going to make the right decision every time. Because sometimes you can have the right passion to do the right thing and still get it wrong sometimes. And so what happens then is, and this is what I see a lot, is that people who aren't successful right out of the gate want to throw in the towel because it didn't work the way that they thought it was going to be. But listen, you can have the right vision and you can have the right gifts, but still have the wrong strategy. And that's what I want to spend some time talking about today as we're introduced to our main character, Moses, in the story. And what he's going to understand, and we're going to see this, that he intuitively is going to understand what he is called to do, but he's going to go about it the wrong way, and that is of such importance for us. Because sometimes if we don't succeed at first, we're like, well, it's a sign that God isn't with me. No, it's just a sign that the way you went about it didn't work. So get some wisdom, get some good counsel, and let's try again to do the thing that God has called us to accomplish. So we're going to start in Exodus chapter 2. We finished chapter 1 last week, so we're starting chapter 2. Excuse me. And here's what we read. It says, "And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him." Now, if you pause there and give me your attention, there's 3 things we're going to look at as we talk about God's purpose in our lives. But the first is this, if you're a note taker, and that is that God is working towards your purpose. He's doing things working toward the purpose that he has for you. Now, this is an amazing story. Now, we aren't going to get the names of this man of Levi and the woman of Levi until chapter 6. But these are Moses' parents, and their names are Amram and Jochebed. Amram and Jochebed, pardon me, are going to have 3 children. Miriam will be the oldest. That's the daughter that we see, the sister that we see a moment ago. Aaron is born next, and then Moses is about 3 years younger. We're told that Moses was a beautiful child. And I personally love that because Moses is our writer. And so he's writing, and he's like, first of all, where do I start? All right. Let me start by telling you how good looking I was. And I just think that's fantastic. So now, when it says that he was a beautiful child, the Hebrew word is tav. And so the word tav can be translated a few different ways. It can be translated as beautiful. It can be translated as special. It can be translated as good. And so if you've ever heard someone say mazel tov, that is the same word, tav, that's used. It's just, we mean it to mean congratulations. Literally in Hebrew, it means a good light from above. And so the tav is good, mazel is light, or light from above. The whole idea is essentially like things have lined up for you to have this good blessing on your life. And so, but tav can mean good, tav can mean special. I think beautiful is a fine translation as well because every parent believes their child is beautiful. Obviously, we know that's not true, but every parent believes that. I'm not saying it, just some kids are ugly. That's just how it is. And so, I'm not saying your children. I'm saying the people in the other services. I'm kidding. And but listen, and I'm telling you, but it is just a fact. I'm not saying that the kids are always ugly. I'm just saying that some kids, like, hey, you got to grow into some of those features, you know. And so, but and I see this, man. Like people who come to Calvary and they have a baby and they're like, Pastor Bob, let me introduce you to our newborn. And it's like, whoa. And but you can't do that. Like you have to be a professional. You have to just like, okay, wow. And you got to just, and so now, and it puts me in a weird spot because I don't want to lie and be like, wow, your child's a beauty. And then they're like, come on, all right, we're the parents, but slow down. All right. So I don't want to do that. And I definitely don't want to be rude. So now what I do is I just look at the child and I'm like, oh, wow, that's a baby. And that's just, that's what I say. And now I can't say it anymore because I just told you my secret. Now I need a new strategy. But that's what I did that for years. I'd be like, wow, that's a baby. And they'd be like, oh, thank you. Yeah, we're just stating the obvious here. And so Jochebed hides Moses for 3 months. And when she can't hide him any longer, she puts him in this little ark on the banks of the Nile River. Now, let me pause for a minute, give you a little bit of some ancient Near East background, because I know when you got up this morning, you're like, man, if Pastor Bob could talk about some ancient Near East background, that would be the thing I'm hoping for. But if you thought that this morning, you are in luck. So, but this is something that people talk about to discredit the Bible, and I think that this is an important conversation. So, there is a story that's told about 2300 BC. It's a story of the birth of Sargon I, who was the Akkadian king. Now, he lived about, as I said, 2300 BC, which is about 800 years before the story of Exodus. Now, his story, the birth of his story, has some similarities to the birth of Moses. His mom puts him in this little kind of floating bassinet, whatever it is, and brings him down the river. It's not the Nile, it's actually the Euphrates. And he is found by a gardener and then the gardener raises him, and he goes on to become the king of his people. Not exact, but it has similarities to Moses' birth. And so what people will say is, especially, secular people, is that the Exodus story is a copy of the Sargon story from 2300 BC, and the reason that this is not how Moses was born, but they shared that so that it would reminisce of the Sargon story, because this is really the birth of a savior type of person, a deliverer type of person, and so they're doing that. Okay. So a couple of things that we need to find out, and that is, you say that this story is from 2300 BC, but the question is, how old are the copies of the... And so whether it's in stone or whether it's in cuneiform, which are those big kind of cylinders, or whether it's written on papyrus or some type of ancient document, how old are those copies? So the oldest copy that we have of the story of Sargon is the 8th century BC, which is about 700 years after the birth of Moses. So here's what I argue and have argued in my doctoral studies, and that is that the Sargon story is actually a copy of the Exodus story, not the other way around. And so what scholars will say is, and this is where they kind of push back, and they'll say, well, how can that be when Sargon lived before Moses? And I'll say, you don't have any evidence that this story was written before the birth of Moses. You only have evidence from hundreds of years later. We can write a story about anyone in antiquity, but the only reason that we know that it happened in antiquity is if the documents are ancient. So if we want to write a story about Sargon, what do you want to write about Sargon? Let's start. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That's a good way to start. There was a man named Sargon, and he was, we can say whatever we want. But just because they are referencing someone from 2300 BC doesn't mean that it happened then. And this is where I want us to be educated. Secular scholars question the Bible on everything, but oftentimes will give secular ancient writings a free pass. And their thought is, once again, this is the argument. Why would the person who wrote the Sargon story lie? Well, if that's the line of reasoning, why would the person who wrote the Bible lie? Why does anybody lie? And they'll say, well, but the Bible has to be verified. Here's my position. If you're going to verify, let's verify all of it. But we're not going to give other ancient documents a free pass on verification that we don't give the Bible. This is the thing that I think is so important for us, is that we sometimes, when people are presenting their data, we've got to sometimes not agree with the premise of the question and reject the premise of the question. And so it's well, obviously this is a copy. Why? Well, because Sargon lived in 2300 BC. Okay, what else? But you don't have any documentation that's anywhere near that old. You have nothing that predates the birth of Moses saying that it was that old. And this is the problem. And this is the problem. And they'll just be, well, but no. And this is where I think, and I tell my kids this all the time, a lot of times people will make a statement. And then this is what they know about this topic. And they give you their 10 words that they know. And so I tell my kids this all the time. Ask for the next 10 words. What are the next thing? How do you substantiate that statement? Well, they got nothing to substantiate that statement. And if you got nothing to substantiate the statement, we have to reject it whole cloth. So more on that later, but just as I think it's an important thing to note, especially in regards to this story. So now, but I will say this. While the Jochebed story didn't copy Sargon's story, it did copy another ancient story. It tells us in these opening verses that Jochebed put him in an ark. Now, this is, it's little, right? It's big enough to fit a baby, but the only time that Hebrew word is used elsewhere in the Bible is in Genesis 6 through 9 to talk about the ark that Noah built. And once again, Moses, the writer of Genesis and Exodus, is drawing a parallel between these two very specific words that he only uses in these two places. That if God could preserve Noah's family, then Jochebed believed that God could preserve her son. I want you to think for a minute what it takes to put your child in a floating bassinet and trust that God is going to take care of them. This is why before Moses shows up in the Hall of Faith, Moses' parents show up in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. It says this in Hebrews 11:23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. Listen, if you and I want our kids to be world changers and we want our kids to walk with God, they need to see that modeled by their parents. Parents, let me tell you something. Be a thermostat, not a thermometer. A thermometer will tell you what the temperature is. A thermostat can change the temperature in the room. And you and I have the ability to create a culture in our home that produces these kinds of kids and these kinds of results. You've just got to ask yourself, what kind of culture do you want in your home, and what is it that you want to pass on to your kids? So I'll tell you this question that my wife gets asked, but I'll tell you the number one question my wife gets asked, and that is every time I tell a story, my wife gets asked, hey, did those stories that Pastor Bob tells, did they really happen? And she's like, yes, it really happened. We live a crazy life. And so the second question she gets asked is Pastor Bob this funny at home? That's the second question she gets asked, and her answer is no. She says, he's much funnier at home. And so I'm like, my kids agree, and I'm like, wow, that's a really nice thing to say. So, but listen, Carrie and I, when we got married, we wanted our family to have a culture of joy and laughter. That was the thing. We both grew up in kind of depressing, somewhat violent homes, and we decided that story ended with us, and that the legacy of our family was not going to be that we were going to change that, and that we could create a different kind of culture. And I've seen that. Listen, all three of my kids are hilarious, and it's so great. And but of the three, my daughter Olivia is the funniest. She is hilarious. And by the way, it's amazing to me. My daughter Olivia spoke at a quinceañera on Friday, and it was our first public speaking thing. And so, and I talked to her a little bit. What are you going to talk about? But I mean, she wrote this amazing, 2 or 3 minute speech. I mean, she engaged everybody. Everybody was laughing, and I'm just like, look at my young Padawan, just doing so well. Anyway, but there are moments at home when Livy and I will make the exact same joke at the exact same time, and it's totally uncanny. And I'm like, anyway, it's amazing. And so now, I think of this every time I walk into a supermarket. I think about this for the last 4 years. So Livy and I go food shopping a good bit for our house, and so Livy is usually my buddy that comes with me every time, and so we're walking. This is like at the very beginning. This is like 4 years ago, the very beginning of the pandemic. We weren't really sure what coronavirus was, and but people were very concerned and all that, and so any move that people made, and so we're in the now listen, it got crazy during the pandemic. I remember I was in Whole Foods during the pandemic, and I sneezed. You would have thought I pulled out a semi-automatic weapon just with my sneeze. People were running for the doors. Anyway, I digress. But Livy and I are in the dairy section at Publix, and it is packed. You can't even move. And 8-year-old Livy at the time, she starts coughing. And she starts coughing loud enough for everyone to hear. And then she's like, wow, that coronavirus really got me. And you see people turn and they just, and they start running out. And I tell her, and I'm like, girl, I have never loved you more than I do right now. And listen, we have watched our 3 kids flourish into people who love the Lord. They love to serve Him. They love to serve God's people. And that's just the culture we've created. And my point is this. Whatever culture you want to create and what you want your kids to become, the things that you're praying to instill in your kids, keep praying that gets instilled in their kids. But there are practical things we can do as well. And that is what you want to instill in your kids, model it. And it'll happen, and create that culture around them, and it'll take place. So Jochebed takes her child, puts him into the water in this little floating bassinet, and here's what happens in verse 5. It says, then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked on the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moshe, or Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." And that's what the name Moshe in Hebrew means, is to draw out. Okay. Second thing that I want you to know. Number one is that God is working towards your purpose. Number two, if you're a note taker, God is orchestrating providential circumstances. Now, a couple things that I want you to note here. One is that the Egyptians worshipped, one of the gods that the Egyptians worshipped was the Nile River. In fact, more than one Egyptian god was associated with the Nile. Some were connected to the water of the Nile. Some were connected to the animals that were living in the Nile, and the god Osiris was overseeing all of it. Now, this is important to know, because when we get to chapter 7 and we see the beginning of the 10 plagues that are inflicted on the Egyptians, this is all connected to the gods of Egypt. If you're a Bible student, then I want you to understand that the bowl judgments in the book of Revelation, chapter 16, are connected textually to the plagues in Egypt. But I want you to think about this as we get back to the text. And that is, you are an Egyptian princess. You believe in these gods that are connected to the Nile. These are part of the pantheon of gods that you worship. And so, now, she's not primarily in the Nile itself, but one of the inlets of the Nile, because the Nile itself is infested with crocodiles. And so, but you see this little floating ark. You don't know what it is. And then you open it up, and it's a child. I mean, if you are someone who worships the gods associated with the Nile, and you see this child, you think this child is a gift from the gods. And so the fact that also, and this is important too, the fact that the princess is bathing in one of these little inlets also means that Jochebed is probably a little more strategic in her placement of Moses than we give her credit for. So, and this is part of this, the amazing part of the story, is that Pharaoh's daughter speaks to Miriam, who's Moses' sister, because she's kind of watching the whole scene, and she says, "Hey, you want me to get somebody to go nurse this child?" Like, "Yeah, that's sure." So she goes and gets her mom and says, "Hey, this thing, it worked." And so she gets Moses' mom to be Moses' wet nurse. And by the way, archaeologists have found in the ancient Near East what are called wet nurse contracts, where nurses are hired to nurse and rear an infant for a period of time, exactly like we read in Exodus. There's all kinds of documentation on this. So now, but it's amazing how God works out the circumstance for Moses to be raised by his mom, and that his mom is going to be paid by Pharaoh's daughter to raise her own child. Like, wow, that is a good situation, right? And I don't know if you know this, but there was a study that was done, like, what is the worth of a mom? Like, if you had to hire people to do everything that a mom would do, and they worked it out that it's because of the 24-hour on-call, it's basically 17 full-time jobs. And so the rate for that would be just a touch over $500,000 a year. And I tell you all that to say, if you have a mom, you got a bargain. So anyway, and she is irreplaceable. So, and now, so here's another thing that's important to note. So Jochebed didn't release her child, and I think that sometimes it gets presented like Jochebed just pushed the thing, like released the child into the crocodile-infested waters of the Nile. Probably not quite that. She had a plan. She put him in the Nile, sending him in the direction of the inlet where Pharaoh's daughter was, hoping that it would reach Pharaoh's daughter and that God would do something. But listen, even if you have a plan, the minute that you let go of that floating bassinet, the only thing you can do at that moment is trust God. And I'm telling you this because I hear Christians often try to put these two things as contrasting ideas, like, well, you can either have faith and trust God, or you can have a plan and a strategy, but you can't do both. And like, as if that, like, it might sound spiritual, but it's not. The scriptures teach just the opposite. In Proverbs 21, it says, "The plans of the diligent surely lead to plenty, but those of everyone who is hasty surely to poverty." I believe, it is responsible to plan, and God is expecting whatever he calls us to do for us to take it seriously. But there comes a point in time where we've done everything that we can do, and then we've got to trust God that he's going to fulfill his promise to us. And by the way, I'll make this argument that the people who plan are the people who really have faith. Why? Because their actions are in line with what they're saying. That they are, their actions are, we believe that God is going to move, and that's why we're planning for it. So several years ago, I mean, it's probably going back like 20 years, we were living in a townhouse in Miami Lakes, and we had a Category 1 hurricane. I don't know what name it was. You know, all these names are so innocuous. You know, like Hurricane Charlie. Like, what kind of Charlie? That's I mean, I guess Charles Manson. But most Charlies are kind of just like nice people, right? And but that's why I have this whole thing. We got to change the names of hurricanes. We got to change it to something really gruesome. Like, you know, have you heard the new hurricane? It's called Death from Above. And like, oh, so I got to take that seriously. The reason we don't take it seriously is because of these names. It's like, you know, have you heard about Irma, Hurricane Irma? I know an Irma. She's delightful. She would never harm my house. And so, but that's the problem, is that we don't give it a name that's, you know, or I think we should name them after like credit card companies. Hurricane American Express is coming. Run for your life. You know, I think that would change it too. Anyway, so we get this Category 1. So let me ask this: how many of you are like, you're a person who plans? You hear about a hurricane and you're out there buying stuff, shuttering. Anybody? You're getting ready. Few people want to admit it. All right, good for you. God bless you. How many of you are like, if it ain't a Category 5, I'm not getting out of bed? Okay. So can I speak on behalf of all these people, which are my people? All right. If you are married to any of us, I just want to say on behalf of all of us, we're sorry, because we know that we have created a lot of stress. And listen, the reason why we don't do anything is because the news goes crazy, 24-hour coverage, and then it's like, even when the hurricane makes a turn and it's going away from us, they're like, you never know, it might make a U-turn and come back. You know, it's like, stop it, it's over. Like, you're done with your ratings. Anyway, so we have this hurricane. I say it's not coming. Carrie says it is, and so we don't do anything. And then, anyway, the hurricane hit, and that really bothered me. Not so much because the hurricane hit, but because I was wrong. And I knew I was going to hear it. So I wake up in the middle of the night, and I hear something, and I go out into our living room, and I see something I'd never seen before. The sliding glass doors in my living room were buckling, like they were bending. First of all, I didn't know sliding glass doors could bend like that. I didn't know glass could bend like that. And I thought, dude, if this bends anymore, I'm going to have a totally different situation on my hands. So I grabbed the handles to the doors, and so I'm standing there holding them, keeping the doors, the sliders from buckling. Well, in the middle of all of that, my wife wakes up, and she sees the wind howling. It's terrible outside, like it's hitting. And she sees me holding the doors, and I was like, oh, hey, what are you up to? And she doesn't even say a word. She just gives me this look. And I know what that look meant. The look was, I had so many guys interested in me. And I married this idiot. And then I didn't say anything. I just gave her a different look, which was like, we said till death, right? And because that might be tonight. And so anyway, so she comes over, and we held the doors together for probably over an hour. And then the next morning, we had a really delightful conversation about hurricane preparedness. And now, here's the thing, is that I didn't plan because I didn't really believe the storm was coming. When you believe the storm is coming, you're going to plan. And the same thing is true in the economy of God. Believing that God has called us, equipped us, and empowered us means we make a plan for him to move. Like, what are we going to do? Let's get wisdom. And then when we do what we're called to do, we can watch God do the part that only he can do. So, he's raised as Pharaoh's daughter, and now this is where we go into like the time warp of like 40 years. Like, Moses is born, and now we're going to see him at 40 years old, hitting the prime of life, and which is what men over 40 would say. So anyway, I have too many stories, but I'm just going to start reading. Verse 11. It says, now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And so he looked this way and that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, why are you striking your companion? And then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Dun, dun, dun. I don't know if you know this, but that dun, dun, dun is in the Hebrew. And you don't see it in English. No, it's verse 12. And then, so Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Ruel, their father, that's also translated Jethro, he said, how is it that you have come so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock. So then he said to his daughters, where is he? Why is it that you have left him? You have left the man. Call him that he may eat bread. So Moses was content to live with the man. By the way, like this, that escalated. Hey, you want to come over for some bread? Sure, I'd be happy to start living with you. So Moses was content. It's like, I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight, but if you don't mind, I'd prefer to have some bread. And if you have a room, that'd be great. And your daughter's cute. And because look, it says he was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses. And she bore him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. If you pause there and give me your attention. Here's the last thing in your notes, and that is, when we talk about God's purpose, here's another thing that God is doing. God is giving you time to mature. Listen, this is the hardest lesson. It's the hardest lesson for Moses. It's the hardest lesson for us. And because sometimes, once again, we will go about doing what God wants us to do, but we go about it in the wrong way. So let me give you some commentary on this passage in Exodus from our brother Stephen. Stephen preached probably one of the greatest sermons in church history in Acts chapter 7. And he said this in verse 23. He says, now when he, Moses, was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. Listen, Moses knew, according to Stephen, he's like, Moses knew that he was called to deliver the people of Israel. The problem is he was going about it all the wrong way. And I hear people say this, that, if God is leading you, you aren't going to make any mistakes. You just do what God tells you. The people who say that are people who have not done anything. Because it sounds spiritual, but it's just not reality. The truth is, God isn't going to tell you everything. God isn't going to tell you exactly what to do in every situation. You know why? Because if he did, we would have no need for wisdom. We would just call the hotline. What do I do? Okay. So just the 6-inch sub, not the foot long. All right, got it. And so no extra mayonnaise. All right, fine. That's what I'll do. And so, but that's not what happens. Instead, God tells us this: get wisdom, though it costs you everything you have. Get understanding. God wants us to be people of wisdom and substance. And that comes from listening to God. And it comes from getting wisdom. You know what else it comes from? It comes from making some mistakes. God is going to, this is so hard for us because when we feel like, hey, God is leading me to do something, we think it's going to be smooth sailing. But that's never how it works out. There's always bumps along the way. And sometimes God allows those bumps to happen because we gain wisdom in the evaluation of the mistakes. And every one of us has a story like that. It's like, I thought this, I made this mistake, I learned from it, and I moved on. Now, it's silly, but I run into people that attend here all the time. And then sometimes I'll run into people who maybe will recognize me or they will have attended here one time, but because they don't really know me, they'll recognize me but can't place me, which those are really my favorite interactions. But it is always funny to run into people who, wherever I go and I run into someone from Calvary, they're always totally shocked that I'm there. And so I'll be at Publix and they'll be like, Pastor Bob, what in the world are you doing here? Why aren't you at church? And I'm like, well, I don't live there. I mean, and church doesn't have a produce department. And that's It's like, I thought you just lived in that little closet under the stairs in the lobby. You and Harry Potter, lived under the stairs. Like, no, that's not how it works. And so, but there's this thing I used to say whenever I would, every time I would run into someone who couldn't place me. Like, you look so familiar. And so I would try to have fun with them. And so I would make this joke, which I'm going to tell you the joke. It's hilarious. And now you might be able to use it. I can't use it anymore just because I got into trouble. But anyway, so anytime someone would come up to me and say, oh, you look familiar, where do I know you from? I would make this joke until one day I was at this event, and this lady walks up to me and she says, you look so familiar, where do I know you from? And so I say, have you ever been to prison? And you see? It's hilarious. That is hilarious, and you feel free to use that royalty free, all right? So, anyway, and I have been saying that for years, and most people laugh, like, oh, that's funny, and then I'm a pastor at Calvary, and then, we all have a good laugh, and that's it. And but this one day, I'm talking to this lady, she's like, where do I know you from? And I'm like, oh, have you ever been to prison? And she's like, well, that was a different time in my life. And I'm like, oh no. Oh no. And then she walked away and never spoke to me again. And I, you know what? And I learned that day I learned that you don't, within the first 30 seconds of meeting them, you don't ask if they've been to a state correctional facility. That is one of the things I learned. Now, God's plan for Moses is to get him out of Egypt and then spend some time getting Egypt out of him. So that he can speak to him and be on the mission to reach his people. Now, let me tell you what happens. Moses, the children of Israel, they're living right here. Moses kills the Egyptian, and he starts running. And he runs all the way through, this is a long way. This is a couple hundred miles. He runs from this land, the area here in Goshen. He runs through the Sinai Peninsula and all the way down to this area called Midian. And this is where he finds himself sitting by a well, and he runs into Zipporah, her sisters, and of course, Ruel or Jethro. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. The daughters of Ruel see Moses, and he's like, hey, how'd you get home so quick? And they say, we saw this Egyptian sitting by the well, and he helped us. How would they know that? Because Moses was probably dressed like an Egyptian. He probably spoke like an Egyptian, and if the song is right, he probably walked like an Egyptian. And you didn't think I was going to go through a whole series in Exodus without referencing that song even once. This is only the first time I've referenced that. I will be doing the whistling part pretty soon in an upcoming message. Now, listen, but here's the thing. God's got to strip all that away, and that's going to take time. And this is the other part of God's call and purpose in our lives that's so tough for us. This is the part where we enter God's waiting room. And Moses is going to spend 40 years in the waiting room until God is ready to speak to him and lay out the mission that he has prepared for him. Because listen, at 40 years old, Moses had the right vision and he had the right call. But he thought he could do it alone, and it was a disaster. In our next message in chapter 3, he is going to hear the call from God, be empowered by God, and God is going to go before him and do things for him that he could never do for himself. And my friends, this is why the communion table is such an important part of our lives. Communion, of course, comes from the Passover that we'll read about when we get to chapter 12. But it's celebrated with eating the unleavened bread, that is bread that hasn't risen. Of course, the Bible teaches the reason that it's done with unleavened bread is because to remind us of the time of when the children of Israel left Egypt and they didn't have time in baking bread for it to rise. But the rabbis teach that there's another reason why unleavened bread was used, and that it was a lesson in humility. Because by nature we want to puff ourselves up, and by nature we want to make ourselves seem like more than we are. And we want to seem like we've got it under control and we're self-sufficient. And listen, communion reminds us what 40 years on the backside of the desert is going to teach Moses, that we are a people who don't have it all together, and that we need the call of God, the purpose of God, and the power of God in our lives if we're going to do the work of God that he wants us to do. And when we realize that we can come to him, not with accomplishments or not with, let me tell you who I am. No. That we come to God humbling ourselves because he sees us for who we really are. And he loves us anyway. And he wants to empower us to do what he's called us to do. So I'm going to invite the ushers to come forward, and they are going to hand out the communion elements. In a moment, the band is going to sing. And here's what I want to encourage you to do in this time that we have together. I'm just going to encourage you that maybe this is a moment to just realign your own heart with what God has called you to do, what you feel God is leading you to do, and that we recognize that, God, you're going to do your part, but I want to be faithful in whatever has been entrusted to me. And maybe it's in a moment like now, in a moment of humility, that God will meet us and speak to us, and that we'll leave this place different than when we came in. So Pastor George, if you lead us.
I long for the moments where I'm still in your presence. All the noise dies down. Lord, speak to me now. You have all my attention. I will linger and listen. I can't miss a thing. Lord, I know my heart wants more of you. My heart wants something new, so I surrender all. 'Cause all I want is to live within your love, being done by who you are. My desire is to know you deeper. Lord, I will open up again, throw my fears into the wind. I am desperate for a touch of heaven.
In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says, "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the same night in which he was betrayed took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" Let's partake of the bread together. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Let's partake of the cup together. And Lord, we want to thank you for that. We thank you for the reminder. We thank you for the moment that communion brings, when we can humble ourselves before you and recognize, even as your son said, "Without me, you can do nothing." So Lord, help us to recognize that and still be faithful in everything that you've called us to do and who you have called us to be. Because Lord, even as we sang, that is our desire, is to know you more deeply. And we pray it in Jesus' name, and everybody said, amen. Amen.
Thank you for joining us today. If you made a decision to follow Jesus and begin a relationship with him, congratulations. It's the best decision you're ever going to make. You may be wondering, so what happens now? Where do I go from here? Just text BEGIN to 62488 and we'll be able to send you this free gift. It's a book called Begin, written by Pastor Bob, and it's going to help you take those first steps on your new journey of faith. So remember, to stay up to date with everything happening at Calvary, follow @MyCalvary on Instagram and Facebook. Until next week, we love you, we're praying for you. God bless you.